The Holy Bible, 66 books total, 39 books in the Old Testament, 1 Genesis, 2 Exodus, 3 Leviticus, 4 Numbers, 5 Deuteronomy, 6 Joshua, 7 Judges, 8 Ruth, 9 1 Samuel, 10 2 Samuel, 11 1 Kings, 12 2 Kings, 13 1 Chronicles, 14 2 Chronicles, 15 Ezra, 16 Nehemiah, 17 Esther, 18 Job, 19 Psalms, 20 Proverbs, 21 Ecclesiastics, 22 Song of Solomon, 23 Isaiah, 24 Jeremiah, 25 Lamentations, 26 Ezekiel, 27 Daniel, 28 Hosea, 29 Joel, 30 Amos, 31 Obadiah, 32 Jonah, 33 Micah, 34 Nahum, 35 Habakkuk, 36 Zephaniah, 37 Haggai, 38 Zechariah, 39 Malachi, 27 books in the New Testament, 41 Matthew, 41 2 Mark, 42 3 Luke, 43 4 John, 44 5 Acts, 45 6 Romans, 46 7 1 Corinthians, 47 8 2 Corinthians, 48 9 Galatians, 49 10 Ephesians, 50 11 Philippians, 51 12 Colossians, 52 13 1 Thessalonians, 53 14 2 Thessalonians, 54 15 1 Timothy, 55 16 2 Timothy, 56 17 Titus, 57 18 Philemon, 58 19 Hebrews, 59 20 James, 60 21 1 Peter, 61 22 2 Peter, 62 23 1 John, 63 24 2 John, 64 25 3 John, 65 26 Jude, 66 27 Revelation. Bible consists of 66 books with 2 distinct sections, the Old Testament, 39 books, and the New Testament, 27 books. The Old Testament, the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, also known as the Jewish Tanakh, is the first 39 books in most Christian Bibles. The name stands for the original promise with God, to the descendants of Abraham in particular, prior to the coming of Jesus Christ in the New Testament, or the New Promise. The Old Testament contains the creation of the universe, the history of the patriarchs, the exodus from Egypt, the formation of Israel as a nation, the subsequent decline and fall of the nation, the prophets, who spoke for God, and the wisdom books. Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Bible. Pentateuch means simply 5 books. In Greek, the Pentateuch, which Jews call the Torah, includes the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These contain some of the oldest and most famous stories in the Bible, including those of Adam and Eve, Jacob and his brothers, and Moses, as well as some of the oldest codes of law known, including the 10 Commandments. Genesis, 50 chapters. Genesis is the book of beginnings. It records the beginning of time, life, sin, salvation, the human race, and the Hebrew nation. It begins with primeval history centered in 4 major events: the creation, the fall, the flood, and the dispersion of the nations. Genesis then narrates the history of 4 great patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob and Joseph. The English title, Genesis, comes from the Greek translation meaning origins, whereas the Hebrew title is derived from the Bible's very first word translated in the beginning. Genesis serves to introduce the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and the entire Bible. Genesis explains how everything began. In fact, the Bible is the only sacred book that accurately does so. Genesis explains how God created the universe, including all the animals and humans. It describes the temptation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It includes a good narrative of human history up to the time of the Jewish exile in Egypt. There are some lists of family trees, generally lasting a page or so. Exodus, 40 chapters. Exodus describes the history of the Israelites leaving Egypt after slavery. The book lays a foundational theology in which God reveals His name, His attributes, His redemption, His law and how He is to be worshipped. Exodus is a Latin word derived from the Greek, Exodos, a solemn procession, departure, literally a going out, figuratively way out, that means a word of uncertain origin. The book is so called because it tells of the departure of the Israelites from Egypt, under the leadership of Moses. General sense departure from a place, especially the migration of large bodies of people or animals from one country or region to another. Exodus explains how God, using Moses as his earthly commander-in-chief, freed the Jews from the Egyptians' Pharaoh using 10 plagues. This book includes the famous climax of the Jewish escape, the crossing of the Red Sea. The book theory describes the people's wanderings and rebellious nature, and how the 10 Commandments came to be. Leviticus, 27 chapters. The book of Leviticus contains a lot of information. The topics include instructions for various ceremonies and holidays, allowed forbidden behavior, and the penalties for disobedience, sacrifices, priests' duties, dealing with various diseases, and property rights. Leviticus receives its name from the Septuagint, the pre-Christian Greek translation of the Old Testament, and means concerning the Levites, the priests of Israel. It serves as a manual of regulations enabling the Holy King to set up his earthly throne among the people of his kingdom. It explains how they are to be his holy people and to worship him in a holy manner. Numbers, 36 chapters. Numbers is a combination of an ancient census and job description for God's people more than 3,000 years ago. Although early chapters are not easy reading, the book becomes a historical adventure starting in chapter 10. And Numbers relates the story of Israel's journey from Mount Sinai to the plains of Moab on the border of Canaan. The book tells of the murmuring and rebellion of God's people and of their subsequent judgment. Deuteronomy, 34 chapters. Moses, now an old man, summarizes the history of the Jewish nation. Joshua is chosen as Moses' successor to lead the people into the promised land they have been looking forward to settling in for 40 years. Deuteronomy means repetition of the law. It serves as a reminder to God's people about his covenant. The book is a pause before Joshua's conquest begins and a reminder of what God required. Historical books. The next 12 Bible books. There are 12 books in this part of the Old Testament: Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. These books were composed at different times and places but have been arranged in a sequence that tells the story of God's people from the occupation of Canaan through the rise and fall of the northern and southern kingdoms, and the return and rebuilding of Jerusalem in the Persian period. Joshua, 24 chapters. Joshua is a book of war and conquest, including the famous attack on the city of Jericho and fulfillment for the people of God. After many years of slavery in Egypt and 40 years in the desert, the Israelites were finally allowed to enter the land promised to their fathers. And the land is divided between the 12 tribes of Israel. Judges, 21 chapters. The violence and intrigue in the book of Judges makes it read somewhat like today's newspaper, showing just how far some people can fall morally. The mere fact that these awful events are recorded adds proof that the Bible is not an edited book. You may recognize a number of names and stories in this book, including Samson. The book of Judges depicts the life of Israel in the Promised Land from the death of Joshua to the rise of the monarchy. It tells of urgent appeals to God in times of crisis and apostasy, moving the Lord to raise up leaders, judges, through whom he throws off foreign oppressors and restores the land to peace. Ruth, 4 chapters. Taking place during the time of the book of Judges, Ruth is the story of a beautiful young widow who comes to Israel from a foreign land. The book of Ruth has been called one of the best examples of short narrative ever written. It presents an account of the remnant of true faith and piety in the period of the Judges through the fall and restoration of Naomi and her daughter-in-law, Ruth, an ancestor of King David and Jesus. 1 Samuel, 31 chapters. The scrolls of long ago could only hold so much handwritten information before they became too big to handle. The book of Samuel was one of these books, so it was divided into 2 parts: 1st and 2nd Samuel. 1st Samuel includes a number of famous stories, including that of David and Goliath. Samuel relates God's establishment of a political system in Israel headed by a human king. Through Samuel's life, we see the rise of the monarchy and the tragedy of its first king, Saul. 2 Samuel 24 chapters in 2 Samuel, David is now king, but there is a great deal of trouble brewing. If you thought everyone in the Bible was perfect, you have not read the book of 2 Samuel. Sure, there is enough murder, adultery, and intrigue in this book, and all historically true of course, to put a soap opera to shame after the failure of King Saul. 2 Samuel depicts David as a true, though imperfect, representative of the ideal theocratic king. Under David's rule the Lord caused the nation to prosper, to defeat its enemies, and to realize the fulfillment of God's promises. 1 Kings 22 chapters. The history of Israel's kings continues, including the wisest and richest, Solomon, and the most evil, Ahab, with plenty of help from his queen, Jezebel. Even God's prophets and the idol-worshipping priests of Baal join in the constant conflict. 1 Kings continues the account of the monarchy in Israel and God's involvement through the prophets. David, his son Solomon, ascends the throne of a united kingdom, but this unity only lasts during his reign. The book explores how each subsequent king in Israel and Judah answers God's call, or, as often happens, they fail to listen. 2 Kings 25 chapters. The conflict and intrigue continue. Good kings, bad kings, prophets, and miracles fill this book. Ultimately, almost everyone degrades morally to the lowest level until God cannot take it anymore, and he has the Assyrians and Babylonians crush Israel. You have to read the book to understand how this takes place. Although 2 Kings does not have a happy ending, this is an accurate recording of history. 2 Kings carries the historical account of Judah and Israel forward. The kings of each nation are judged in light of their obedience to the covenant with God. Ultimately, the people of both nations are exiled for disobedience. 1 Chronicles 29 chapters. 1 Chronicles is sort of a combination of Numbers and 1 Kings. Just as the author of Kings had organized and interpreted Israel's history to address the needs of the exiled community, so the writer of 1 Chronicles wrote for the restored community. 2 Chronicles 36 chapters. 2 Chronicles is a parallel of the book of 2 Kings, from the perspective of the Jewish priests. 2 Chronicles continues the account of Israel's history with an eye for restoration of those who had returned from exile. Ezra 10 chapters. After the fall of the Babylonian Empire, the Persian king allowed some Jewish captives to return to their homeland with Ezra. This book focuses on their return and the rebuilding of their city, temple, and lives. Surrounded by enemies, it was not easy. The book of Ezra relates how God's covenant people were restored from Babylonian exile to the covenant land as a theocratic, kingdom of God, community even while continuing under foreign rule. Nehemiah 13 chapters. Nehemiah, sort of a religious stormtrooper, decides Israel has taken enough abuse from their enemies and organizes the rebuilding of a fortified wall surrounding Jerusalem. This documentation of Nehemiah's courage and leadership is very inspiring. Closely related to the book of Ezra, Nehemiah chronicles the return of this cupbearer to the king, and the challenges he and the other Israelites face in their restored homeland. Esther 10 chapters. Another of the Bible's great storybooks, this true account of a beautiful queen and an evil prime minister is better than fiction. Esther records the institution of the annual festival of Purim through the historical account of Esther, a Jewish girl who becomes queen of Persia and saves her people from destruction. Books of Wisdom. The next 5 Bible books, referred to as wisdom literature. These 5 books deal precisely with our human struggles and real-life experiences. The books of wisdom include Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. They contain the poetry of the Hebrew nation and they provide the reader with important stories and wisdom. Job 42 chapters. Job marvelously demonstrates the conflict of good and evil. It also shows how well-meaning friends can cause more damage than good. In Bible terms, this book is considered wisdom literature because of the wisdom and insight it gives to the reader. Through a series of monologues, The book of Job relates the account of a righteous man who suffers under terrible circumstances. The book's profound insights, its literary structures, and the quality of its rhetoric display of the author's genius. Psalms 150 chapters. Psalms is the longest book in the Bible and probably the most loved. I recommend reading 1 or 2 Psalms each day and doing the rest of your reading in another book of the Bible. The Psalms are collected songs and poems that represent centuries worth of praises and prayers to God on a number of themes and circumstances. The Psalms are impassioned, vivid and concrete. They are rich in images, in simile and metaphor. Proverbs 31 chapters. Proverbs is the most practical book in the Bible. The first 7 chapters read like the written advice of a father to a son. The rest of the book is a series of sentences that apply to many daily situations. Many people read a chapter in Proverbs each day as a way of sharpening their business skills while they sharpen their spiritual skills. Proverbs was written to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the young, and to make the wise even wiser. The frequent references to my son emphasize instructing the young and guiding them in a way of life that yields rewarding results. Ecclesiastes 12 chapters. In some respects, Ecclesiastes is the strangest book in the Bible. It describes many pursuits tried by the author to gain pleasure, yet, they all ended up making him feel hollow, rather than satisfied. Sounds familiar? Not surprisingly, the general lesson of this book is that life is futile without God. Song of Solomon 8 chapters, also entitled Song of Songs. This book describes the love between a man and a woman. Although not sexual by today's standards, some societies and cultures discouraged their young people from reading of this book until they were a little older. In ancient Israel, everything human came to expression in words: reverence, gratitude, anger, sorrow, suffering, trust, friendship, commitment. In the Song of Solomon, it is love that finds words inspired, words that disclose its exquisite charm and beauty as one of God's choicest gifts. Major prophets. The next 5 Bible books. The Bible is unique when it comes to its books on prophecy. As an explanation, prophecy describes 2 things: things the people were told to do by God, things that would happen if the people did or did not do what God told them to. The Bible clearly states that although many people claim to speak for God, not all do. The writers of these books were true prophets of God, and proved themselves in the most spectacular way. Of the events that were to have taken place by now, every revelation of God given through these prophets was fulfilled with 100% accuracy. Isaiah 66 chapters. Isaiah is one of the more difficult books in the Bible to understand, yet, it was the book of prophecy most often quoted by Jesus. Isaiah, son of Amoz, is often thought of as the greatest of the writing prophets. His name means the Lord saves. Isaiah is a book that unveils the full dimensions of God's judgment and salvation. Jeremiah 52 chapters. Jeremiah is the longest book of prophecy in the Bible. This book preserves an account of the prophetic ministry of Jeremiah, whose personal life and struggles are shown to us in greater depth and detail than those of any other Old Testament prophet. Lamentations 5 chapters. Lamentations is a series of 5 poems about Jerusalem after its capture by the Babylonians. It naturally follows the book of Jeremiah, where he told the people they would be destroyed if they didn't change their ways, yet they refused to listen. Lamentations consists of a series of poetic and powerful laments over the destruction of Jerusalem. Ezekiel 48 chapters. Of all the books in the Bible, this one comes the closest to describing the physical appearance of God and his angels. The Old Testament in general and the prophets in particular presuppose and teach God's sovereignty over all creation in the course of history, and nowhere in the Bible are God's initiative and control expressed more clearly and pervasively than in the book of the prophet Ezekiel. Daniel 12 chapters. Daniel includes several of the most famous stories in the Bible, including Daniel and the lion's den. The last chapters are very symbolic and difficult to understand, Daniel captures the major events in the life of the prophet Daniel during Israel's exile. His life and visions point to God's plans of redemption and sovereign control of history. Minor Prophets. The next 12 Bible books, as with the major prophets, the minor prophets, as an explanation, prophecy describes two things: things the people were told to do by God, things that would happen if the people did or did not do what God told them to. The Bible clearly states that although many people claim to speak for God, not all do. The writers of these books were true prophets of God, and proved themselves in the most spectacular way. Of the events that were to have taken place by now, every revelation of God given through these prophets was fulfilled with 100% accuracy. Hosea. 14 chapters. The book of Hosea has an unusual storyline. The prophet is commanded by God to marry a prostitute. You will understand why when you read the book. The prophet Hosea, son of Beeri, lived in the tragic final days of the northern kingdom. His life served as a parable of God's faithfulness to an unfaithful Israel. Joel. 3 chapters. Joel is a short and interesting book. Through this prophet, God uses an analogy of a locust plague to warn the people of Jerusalem that judgment, through the Babylonians, is coming. The prophet Joel warned the people of Judah about God's coming judgment and the coming restoration and blessing that will come through repentance. Amos. 9 chapters. Amos is one of those books of prophecy that gives to everyone an important weapon: the ability to recognize some cults. The book is straightforward, for a book of prophecy, yet many cults refer to the book of Amos, claiming some of its verses were written about them or one of their prophets. Read it yourself and see that Amos was writing to the residents of various 8th century BC capital cities and not about someone who lived in the last 200 years or so. Amos prophesied during the reigns of Josiah over Judah, 792–740 BC, and Jeroboam II, over Israel, 793–753 BC. Obadiah. 1 chapter. Obadiah is the shortest book of prophecy. It is also the shortest book in the Old Testament. It describes the future destruction of one of Israel's enemies, the ancient country of Edom. The prophet Obadiah warned the proud people of Edom about the impending judgment coming upon them. Jonah. 4 chapters. Jonah contains one of the most widely recognized stories in the Bible, that of Jonah being swallowed by a large fish. Jonah is unusual as a prophetic book in that it is a narrative account of Jonah's mission to the city of Nineveh, his resistance, his imprisonment in a great fish, his visit to the city, and the subsequent outcome. Micah. 7 chapters. This little gem is most famous for the passage in chapter 5 that predicts the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem more than 700 years later. Micah prophesied sometime between 750 and 686 BC. During the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, Israel was in an apostate condition. Micah predicted the fall of her capital, Samaria, and also foretold the inevitable desolation of Judah. Nahum. 3 chapters. The book contains the vision of Nahum, whose name means comfort. The focal point of the entire book is the Lord's judgment on Nineveh for her oppression, cruelty, idolatry, and wickedness. Nahum is a book written to the people of Assyria, the greatest nation in the world at that time, and their capital of Nineveh. Nahum tells them their world empire will come to an end if they do not change their ways. They did not believe this prophet from the puny nation of Israel, and they were destroyed 100 years later in 612 BC. Habakkuk. 3 chapters. Habakkuk told the people in Judah, what was left of Israel in those days, to change their ways. Reacting like most people and nations to God's prophets, they told him to get lost. Habakkuk then asked God why the people would not respond properly. God's answer starts in chapter 1. Verse 5. Little is known about Habakkuk except that he was a contemporary of Jeremiah and a man of vigorous faith. The book bearing his name contains a dialogue between the prophet and God concerning injustice and suffering. Habakkuk's name means embraced by God. Zephaniah. 3 chapters. Zephaniah is another book warning the people in 6th century BC Judah, and a few other nations, that judgment was coming if they did not change their ways. The prophet Zephaniah was evidently a person of considerable social standing in Judah and was probably related to the royal line. The intent of the author was to announce to Judah God's approaching judgment. Haggai, 2 chapters. Haggai passes on God's message, encouraging his contemporaries to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem that was destroyed during the Babylonian conquest. It ties in nicely with the book of Ezra. Haggai was a prophet who, along with Zechariah, encouraged the returned exiles to rebuild the temple. His prophecies clearly show the consequences of disobedience. When the people give priority to God and His house, they are blessed. Zechariah, 14 chapters. This is a great book. You not only get a glimpse of what God and the angels are really like, but this book explains many symbols used in prophetic writing. It also refers to the restoration of the temple in Israel after the Babylonian conquest, tying in with the book of Haggai that precedes it. Finally, it contains many important prophecies regarding the coming Messiah fulfilled 500 years later by Jesus Christ. Like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, Zechariah was not only a prophet, but also a member of a priestly family. The chief purpose of Zechariah, and Haggai, was to rebuke the people of Judah and to encourage and motivate them to complete the rebuilding of the temple. Malachi, 4 chapters. Malachi contains what amounts to a humorous and somewhat sarcastic dialogue between God and his hypocritical followers. Malachi, whose name means my messenger, spoke to the Israelites after their return from exile. The theological message of the book can be summed up in one sentence: the great king will come not only to judge his people, but also to bless and restore them. The New Testament, New Covenant. The New Testament is a collection of 27 books centered on the figure of Jesus of Nazareth. Each of these books has its own author, context, theme, and persuasive purpose. Combined, they comprise one of history's most abundant, diverse, complex, and fascinating texts. The books of the New Testament are traditionally divided into 3 categories: the Gospels, the Epistles, and the Book of Revelation. Gospels. The next 4 Bible books, the first 4 books of the New Testament, are known as the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each book tells us about the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Written over the course of almost a century after Jesus' death, the 4 Gospels of the New Testament, though they tell the same story, they reflect very different ideas and concerns. Matthew, 28 chapters. Matthew starts with a list of the ancestors of Jesus. This would be important to a Jewish audience, since Old Testament prophecies required Jesus to have a specific parentage. This explains how Jesus met that requirement. The book is very interesting and contains Jesus' most famous teaching, the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7. Matthew's main purpose in writing his gospel, the Good News, is to prove to his Jewish readers that Jesus is their Messiah. He does this primarily by showing how Jesus in his life and ministry fulfilled the Old Testament scriptures. Mark, 16 chapters. Mark is shorter, and more fast-paced than the other Gospels. I recommend making Mark one of the first books in the Bible you read. Since Mark's Gospel, the Good News, is traditionally associated with Rome, so here we find Jesus presented as the great conqueror of storms, demons, diseases, and death. Mark may be writing to prepare his readers for such suffering by placing before them the life of our Lord. Luke, 24 chapters. Luke is the longest of the 4 Gospels. This is the book in the Bible that best covers the birth of Jesus we hear each Christmas. It also contains a story in chapter 16 that gives us a glimpse of heaven and hell. Like the book of Matthew, this book contains a list of Jesus' ancestors. Yet, it traces the ancestry of Jesus through Mary rather than through Joseph, as the book of Matthew does. Luke's Gospel, the Good News, was written to strengthen the faith of all believers and to answer the attacks of unbelievers. It was presented to debunk some disconnected and ill-founded reports about Jesus. Luke wanted to show that the place of the Gentile, non-Jewish, Christian in God's kingdom is based on the teaching of Jesus. John, 21 chapters. John is the last of the 4 Gospels in the Bible. Different from the others, John opens his book with symbolism. Many people believe that Gospel of John is the best of the 4 Gospels for new Christians, and I recommend reading the Gospel of John first. John's Gospel, the Good News, is rather different from the other 3, highlighting events not detailed in the others. The author himself states his main purpose clearly in chapter 20 verse 31, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. History. The next Bible book, Acts, the 5th book of the New Testament, a valuable history of the early Christian church. Acts, 28 chapters. Acts, also called Acts of the Apostles, or Book of Acts, describes the adventures of the 11 apostles that remain after Jesus' resurrection. This wonderful book starts out with the apostles picking a 12th apostle to replace Judas, who committed suicide after betraying Jesus Christ, and names Matthias as the 12th apostle. The book of Acts provides a bridge for the writings of the New Testament. It joins what Jesus began to do and to teach as told in the Gospels with what he continued to do and teach through the apostles, as well as the establishment of the church. Pauline epistles. The next 13 Bible books. A young man named Saul was bent on eliminating Christianity from the face of the earth. He was a Jew, a Pharisee, well versed in the Old Testament, a man of knowledge, letters, and spirit. Then Jesus directly intervened. The risen Savior appeared to Saul on the road to Damascus, an encounter that completely transformed him. This man Saul became the beloved apostle, saint, evangelist, theologian, and pastor we call Paul. Paul's an important character. Out of the 27 books in the New Testament, Paul wrote 13. Out of all the biblical human authors, Paul has written the most books of the Bible. Most of Paul's letters fall into 2 groups, letters to churches and letters to individuals. Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon. Romans, 16 chapters. The book of Romans is one of the most important books in the Bible. We recommend it as the first one to read after getting a foundation with the 4 Gospels and Acts. It describes why a person would want to be a Christian, and one Paul's primary themes in Romans is presenting the gospel, the good news, God's plan of salvation and righteousness for all humankind, Jew and non-Jew alike. 1 Corinthians, 16 chapters. 1 Corinthians is a letter written to the most corrupt Christian church specifically addressed in the Bible. Appropriately, chapter 13 is one of the most famous in the Bible, powerfully explaining a simple principle that would help get this church, and the rest of us, back on the right track. The first letter to the Corinthians revolves around the theme of problems with Christian conduct in the church. It has to do with progressive sanctification, the continuing development of a holy character. Obviously Paul was personally concerned with the Corinthians' problems, revealing a true pastor's, shepherd's, heart. 2 Corinthians, 13 chapters. 2 Corinthians can be thought of as the sequel to 1 Corinthians. The church followed some of the earlier advice, but still had some problems. A special feature of this book is that it lets Christians know what their heavenly bodies will be like. Because of the occasion that prompted this letter, Paul had a number of purposes in mind, to express the comfort and joy Paul felt because the Corinthians had responded favorably to his painful letter, to let them know about the trouble he went through in the province of Asia, and to explain to them the true nature, its joys, sufferings and rewards, and high calling of Christian ministry. Galatians, 6 chapters. The letter to the Galatians addresses a problem seen in many churches today, adding man-made requirements for being a Christian. This book beautifully reveals how free from external requirements Christianity really is. This is another good book to learn what separates true Christianity from the world's religion. Galatians stands as an eloquent and vigorous apologetic for the essential New Testament truth that people are justified by faith in Jesus Christ by nothing less and nothing more, and that they are sanctified not by legalistic works but by the obedience that comes from faith in God's work for them. Ephesians, 6 chapters. Ephesians has at least 3 special points of interest. First, it explains how people receive special abilities when they become Christians. Second, it outlines the roles of the husband, wife, and child in a family. Third, it describes the spiritual battle taking place around us, about which most of us are not aware. Unlike several of the other letters Paul wrote, Ephesians does not address any particular error or heresy. Paul wrote to expand the horizons of his readers, so that they might understand better the dimensions of God's eternal purpose and grace and come to appreciate the high goals God has for the church. Philippians, 4 chapters. Philippians is a wonderful book. If life is stressing you out, this short book is a good place to go. Paul's primary purpose in writing this letter was to thank the Philippians for the gift they had sent him upon learning of his detention at Rome. However, he makes use of this occasion to fulfill several other desires. 1. To report on his own circumstances. 2. To encourage the Philippians to stand firm in the face of persecution and rejoice regardless of circumstances. And 3. To exhort them to humility and unity. Colossians, 4 chapters. Colossians is another short book. It is especially suited to reading by new Christians, yet anyone, Christian or not, can benefit from reading Colossians. Paul's purpose is to refute the Colossian heresy. To accomplish this goal, he exalts Christ as the very image of God, the Creator, the pre-existent sustainer of all things, the head of the church, the first to be resurrected, the fullness of deity, God, in bodily form, and the reconciler. 1 Thessalonians, 5 chapters. 1 Thessalonians is not only easy to read, but it contains one of the best descriptions in the Bible of what happens to departed Christians. Although the thrust of the letter is varied, the subject of eschatology, doctrine of last things, seems to be predominant in both Thessalonian letters. Every chapter of 1 Thessalonians ends with a reference to the second coming of Christ. 2 Thessalonians, 3 chapters. 2 Thessalonians is a short sequel to 1 Thessalonians. Another short book. It would be easy for anyone to read them both in an evening. Since the situation in the Thessalonian church has not changed substantially, Paul's purpose in writing is very much the same as in his first letter to them. He writes, 1. To encourage persecuted believers, 2. To correct a misunderstanding concerning the Lord's return, and 3. To exhort the Thessalonians to be steadfast and to work for a living. 1 Timothy, 6 chapters. If you want to learn what separates a real church leader from a poor one, 1 Timothy is a great place to find out. During his 4th missionary journey, Paul had instructed Timothy to care for the church at Ephesus while he went on to Macedonia. When he realized that he might not return to Ephesus in the near future, he wrote this first letter to Timothy to develop the charge he had given his young assistant. This is the first of the pastoral epistles. 2 Timothy, 4 chapters. 2 Timothy is not only the best sequel in the Bible, but it also provides comfort for those reaching the end of their road. Paul was concerned about the welfare of the churches during this time of persecution under Nero, and he admonishes Timothy to guard the gospel, to persevere in it, to keep on preaching it, and, if necessary, to suffer for it. This is the second pastoral epistle. Titus, 3 chapters. Titus is a short letter of guidance and encouragement to a young pastor that includes great advice usable by all of us. Apparently Paul introduced Christianity in Crete when he and Titus visited the island, after which he left Titus there to organize the converts. Paul sent the letter with Zenas and Apollos, who were on a journey that took them through Crete, to give Titus personal authorization and guidance in meeting opposition, instructions about faith and conduct, and warnings about false teachers. This is the last of the pastoral epistles. Philemon, 1 chapter. Philemon is a letter, a story, and a lesson rolled into one. To win Philemon's willing acceptance of the runaway slave Onesimus, Paul writes very tactfully and in a light-hearted tone, which he creates with wordplay. The appeal is organized in a way prescribed by ancient Greek and Roman teachers, to build rapport, to persuade the mind, and to move the emotions. General Epistles. The next 8 Bible books. The General Epistles are a collection of 8 letters that were intended to be circulated among all the early churches. They were not sent to any one specific church and, with the exception of 2 and 3 John, do not address individuals by name. Their subject matter is important enough that the authors wanted all the churches to be informed on these matters. James. One of the earliest books of the New Testament was written by James, the half-brother of Jesus, who was the pastor of the church in Jerusalem. And Jude was written by Jude, the half-brother of Jesus. Hebrews. 13 chapters. Hebrews is another of the most important books in the Bible. It is not the easiest book to understand, so read a number of other New Testament books first to give you some background information. The theme of Hebrews is the absolute supremacy and sufficiency of Jesus Christ as revealer and as mediator of God's grace. A striking feature of this presentation of the Gospel is the unique manner in which the author employs expositions of 8 specific passages of the Old Testament scriptures. The author of Hebrews is unknown, but is believed to be Apollos, who came from Alexandria. Some believe it may have been Paul, but most likely not, based on the writing style of Hebrews. James. 5 chapters. James is a cool book, written by Jesus' half-brother. You will find this book very relevant to today's world. Characteristics that make the letter distinctive are: 1. Its unmistakably Jewish nature; 2. Its emphasis on vital Christianity, characterized by good deeds and a faith that works. Genuine faith must and will be accompanied by a consistent lifestyle. 3. Its simple organization. 4. And its familiarity with Jesus' teachings preserved in the Sermon on the Mount. 1 Peter. 5 chapters. Would you like to hear from someone who literally walked the earth with Jesus for 3 years? If so, this is a great book to read. Although 1 Peter is a short letter, it touches on various doctrines and has much to say about Christian life and duties. It is not surprising that different readers have found it to have different principal themes. For example, it has been characterized as a letter of separation, of suffering and persecution, of suffering and glory, of hope, of pilgrimage, of courage, and as a letter dealing with the true grace of God. 2 Peter. 3 chapters. This letter contains more great teaching from one of the apostles. In his first letter, Peter feeds Christ's sheep by instructing them how to deal with persecution from outside the church. In this second letter he teaches them how to deal with false teachers and evildoers, who have come into the church. 1 John. 5 chapters. A letter written by the same person who wrote the Gospel of John. John's readers were confronted with an early form of Gnostic teaching of the Cerinthian variety. This heresy was also libertine, throwing off all moral restraints. Consequently, John wrote this letter with 2 basic purposes in mind: 1. To expose false teachers and, 2. To give believers assurance of salvation. 2 John. 1 chapter. A short letter that warns us all to watch out for and avoid false teachers. During the first 2 centuries the gospel was taken from place to place by traveling evangelists and teachers. Believers customarily took these missionaries into their homes and gave them provisions for their journey when they left. Since Gnostic teachers also relied on this practice, 2 John was written to urge discernment in supporting traveling teachers. 3 John. 1 chapter. This book is a short letter of encouragement. Itinerant teachers sent out by John were rejected in one of the churches in the province of Asia by a dictatorial leader, Diotrephes, who even excommunicated members who showed hospitality to John's messengers. John wrote this letter to commend Gaius for supporting the teachers and, indirectly, to warn Diotrephes. Jude. 1 chapter. The second of 2 books in the Bible written by a half-brother of Jesus. It is another warning against listening to false teachers and false teaching. Although Jude was very eager to write to his readers about salvation, He felt that he must instead warn them about certain immoral men circulating among them who were perverting the grace of God. Apparently these false teachers were trying to convince believers that being saved by grace gave them license to sin since their sins would no longer be held against them. Apocalypse, the next Bible book, a disclosure or a revelation of great knowledge. In religious and occult concepts, an apocalypse usually discloses something very important that was hidden or provides a vision of heavenly secrets that can make sense of earthly realities. 1. Historically, the term has a heavy religious connotation as commonly seen in the prophetic revelations of eschatology obtained through dreams or spiritual visions. It is thought by many Christians that the biblical book of Revelation depicts as an apocalypse, the complete and final destruction of the world. Revelation, 22 chapters. Revelation is the New Testament's one book of prophecy. It is also the only book of prophecy that we really have not gotten to yet in time-wise. Revelation's language is very symbolic, which makes it a difficult book to understand. Still, everyone should read this book at least once, since it does reveal everyone's future. Remember, every prophecy in the Bible came to pass exactly as it was stated when its time came to be fulfilled. Therefore, that will also be the case for the writings in this book.
The Word of God divided in two, each called the Testament, the Old and New. It's really 66 books combined in one, and you're gonna learn them all before the song is done. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, to Joshua,